Welcome back to another great episode of Learning in the Open. I have the incredible honor and pleasure to welcome Governor Jay Inslee to the program here, and I'm also joined by my dear friend Tim Hade. Um, Again, the theory behind learning in the open is that we have an asymmetry in information which disadvantages people that have the least, typically low and middle income people. And so this is an effort to simply share the best practices of financiers, of sales organizations, of technology organizations in being successful in the clean economy, whether that's solar, wave energy, wind energy, nuclear, energy storage, whatever it might be that does not include the violence of the fossil economy. We want people to learn faster to all create abundance faster for your families and for your communities. So thanks again, Jay, to coming on this small little program. And Tim as well. Thank you so much. So I'd just like to start, and Jay actually asked this question before we hit record, which is, geez, I'd love to learn about Tim. And for this little audience, people may not be familiar with Tim, although Tim has a lot of public information out there. Jay, if you don't mind, I'm going to start with Tim really quickly, and then we're going to get on to all the stuff that you're up to right now. Tim, give a very quick thumbnail of what you're up to.
Yeah, so I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. So Tim Hade, I think I know a lot of the people who are probably listening to this, but I started a company called Scale Microgrids like 10 years ago, building solar storage microgrids for commercial and industrial customers. Sold that business to EQT in February this year, so I've kind of been a free agent the last 8 months. Got on this walkabout thinking about what I want to do next. And my current priority in life is putting a battery in every building in the United States. And so that's kind of what I'm working on. But I appreciate you all letting me hijack this podcast because I was talking to Jon a few days ago about separate stuff. And he mentioned that he was doing this. And I was like, oh, I'm the biggest Jay Inslee fan in the world. And he said, well, why don't you come on the podcast and tell him that? And so here I am, and I'm honored here to be here with y'all today.
Well, Tim is also a veteran and he served our country, and we're very grateful for that. And yesterday being Veterans Day, thank you, Tim, for your service, and also a father. So we all share that wonderful facet of our lives of being responsible for young people and teaching, learning ourselves. The playbook for being a parent is imperfect, and we just try to continue to iterate, right? Continue to recalibrate. Where are they? Where can we meet them? Where can we really have the most impact? So now let's get into it. So Jay, thank you again for joining. You honestly, for most of the people that are going to listen to this, you have no need for introduction, but you've now done your work as the governor of the state of Washington. You're now a senior advisor to Wallamy Capital, which is a equity infra blended return type of organization, really making some big pushes into the clean economy. Tell me what you're currently up to and what's most exciting to you. We're going to get to your history, but let's start with today.
Well, being on this podcast is the most exciting thing, of course, because this is the bleeding edge of the clean energy revolution, the people who are listening to this. So I appreciate everybody being part of this community. And it's an exciting community. So I haven't met Tim before, and now he just set my world on fire talking about microgrids, and I'm going to look forward to listening to him about further part of his vision. And the cool things about this energy transformation is it is exciting. There's just new things every day. There's new people every day. Everybody has a chance to plug in. It's a good time to be alive, to be involved in a major transformation of our community, our culture, and our economy, and that's going on right now. So I am really happy to be in this discussion, and I'm still being very active, even though I'm not governor. You mentioned the Wallamy work that I'm doing to try to help figure out where the best investments are. I'm also serving as a national spokesperson for Climate Power, which basically is talking with multiple communities from mainstream media to podcasts about the necessity of clean energy action. I'm also working with a firm trying to create a fund to help wildfire victims because you have so many wildfire victims now because of climate change. So I'm still pretty active in this and really excited about it. And Jon, can I hijack your podcast for a moment?
Do it.
Do it.
Yeah.
So Tim, tell me your vision. You just said, look, you want to put a battery in every building in the United States, beginning with the United States. In your vision, your grand vision, to what extent are those isolated microgrids in the building, and how much are they integrated with the grid in that type of vision that you have? Talk to
Yeah.
me about that.
All right, so we're gonna dive right into the deep end. I mean, it's the right question to ask, right? I mean, I think, my view on this is that everyone benefits with grid interconnected microgrids, and so I think having distributed energy resources in buildings, in homes that can transact with the electricity grid ultimately gives us as a nation the quickest ramp to load growth, which we need for a bunch of reasons, whether it's AI or advanced manufacturing or electric vehicles, but it also creates the most equitable outcome. And so the thing that I really spend a lot of time thinking about, and one of the big concerns I have about the bring your own power approach, right, is we don't want to live in a country where there's kind of two tiers of electrical service where,
Right.
rich people and Fortune 500 companies have access to really reliable, affordable, clean electricity, and the rest of the population doesn't. And I think, the good news about this is we're at a place technically, both on the hardware side and the software side with the advent of, virtual power plants and load aggregators and things like that, where we can create this transactive distributed grid of the future. It's not a technical problem, right? I think there's communication problems and there are political problems and there are business model problems, but it's not a technology problem. And that's the thing that gives me the most hope that this is solvable, right? Is that we have the tech to do it. We just need sort of the political and economic will to get it done.
Well, we've had a 90% reduction essentially in the cost of battery storage in the last decade. So the technology continues to improve. And I think there's every reason to believe it will continue to drive down that cost curve. So there's every reason to be optimistic about this whole vision. Now you've got certain players attempting to develop the sort of virtual, like Octopus Energy, I believe, is
Yeah.
trying to create this. Talk to me about that business plan, how you see that working, number one. And number two, what do you think the most important policy issues there are to advance that? What are the
Sure.
policymakers? What can they do that's most effective in that direction?
Yeah, sure. So, I think Octopus Energy is a fascinating case study, right? Because that's a business that really came out of the UK, right? And I think one of the reasons for people to have hope in the current US market is really the reason the UK has been so innovative in what they've done on their electricity grid is because electricity prices got really unaffordable, right? Prices went up a lot. And so I think part of the challenge that we've had in the United States, and I know you've dealt with this a lot in the state of Washington, is that it's hard to make change when electricity is cheap and plentiful and reliable, right? And so in some ways, I think what we're dealing with right now in the United States, which I would generally refer to as an affordability crisis, I think can really be the catalyst for some change. And so what Octopus Energy did in the UK is they were essentially a retail electricity provider. So they provided electricity to customers, which is regulatorily allowed in the United Kingdom. And what they found is that actually, if we are able to control loads on the demand side, right? So we're able to control thermostats or electric vehicle charging or batteries that are in people's homes or businesses, we can actually co-optimize load and generation and provide the cheapest power to the customer. And that business took off. And so I forget what the exact number is, but Octopus has a massive business in the United Kingdom right now. The software platform that they built to sort of operate that all is known as Kraken, and that's now spinning out into its own IPO. And so I think one of the reasons Octopus is so important is because the market is now seeing that these types of companies are not only good for the planet, and they're not only good for society, but they can also be really lucrative for investors. And so that work that Greg and Nick and their team has done at Octopus, I think has really set the foundation for a lot of excitement in the distributed energy market. Coming back to your second question, there's a lot of policy work and there's a lot of regulatory work that has to happen in the United States in order to sort of recreate what's happening in the UK at the scale of the United States, right? We're obviously a lot bigger and our electric grid is a lot more complex. And look, I think really where it starts is at the utility level with the interconnection process, right? And so we have to figure out a way to for the distributed energy industry and the utility industry to work well together. I think in a lot of cases, state legislatures and state governments are sort of the catalyst that, will make that happen. And so, that's really where I think a lot of the work on the policy side of stuff has to
Yeah.
happen over the next like 2, 3 years.
Well, I've worked on that for a couple decades now with
I know you
imperfect
have.
results. We've been working on net metering for years and talking about a connection. From your experience, what is the most effective way to advance that relationship between the distributed energy industry and the utilities? What's the best way to advance that? I mean, I always thought, we wish we had Jimmy Carter to bring the peace deal to those groups or something. But to what extent should be a regulatory requirement? To what extent should it be just a facilitation between the entities? Is there a technical solution? What do you think helps the most?
Yeah, so it's again an incredible question. I mean, I think look, ultimately, this is a new set of challenges that we're facing in the current market environment because until maybe 36 months ago, there were valid arguments against the technology, right? And so when you were having these conversations with utilities or state legislatures or the federal government, folks at FERC, things like that, part of the challenge was there were real technical concerns in the market about doing this type of load aggregation and how would it respond and could it really be counted as capacity and could it really perform? And what this industry's done over the last 36 months, you mentioned Octopus, but there's a whole lot of players in the US, companies like Voltus and Sea-Power and Sunrun and Tesla that have done, rolled out these incredible virtual power plant programs. And then folks like, Jigger Shaw in the Loan Programs Office who wrote the VPP liftoff report. And there's now just this mountain of evidence that suggests that not only is it technically feasible to do, but that these systems perform when they're called upon to perform. And so I think we've gotten over the technical hurdle, right? Now I think the challenge is primarily economic, right? And so, look, there are just real concerns at the utility level about how you fund and operate these things, right? And I think, we have to be cognizant of the fact that having utilities that are solvent and able to raise money and able to have a reasonable cost of capital are important to building out the grid. At the same time, right, fundamentally what distributed energy resources do is reduce the requirement for utilities to invest in primarily the distribution grid, right? And so when you're thinking about this from a shareholder perspective as an investor-owned utility, you're kind of like, well, wait a minute, like you're talking about reducing the amount of CapEx we invest in the distribution system. We make a guaranteed return on that CapEx investment. And so that's not good for me, right? And so I think, we've kind of gotten to this place in, the utility industry right now where to some extent shareholder value and ratepayer value has kind of diverged a little bit. And I think the real challenge at the legislative level is trying to figure out how to, do the thing that's best for ratepayers, which I think everyone agrees needs to be priority one, but then also acknowledging that there are financial realities that utilities, need to be able to raise capital and they need to be able to do this stuff with an ROE that's reasonable.
Right.
How do we bring along the shareholders with us? And, again, I think that's a huge challenge. Every state is dealing with that in their own way right now. Again, I don't think the transition that we've gone through at the federal government over the past 12 months has necessarily helped. Certainly, there's been a lot of consternation that I think has delayed things. But, that's really the conversation I think that's happening at the state level right now. That's really.
By the way, you are so gracious to describe it as a transition when actually it's a catastrophic apocalyptic disaster. So you're very gracious in your description of it. And it is true. You think about the utilities. Here you have a president of the United States that's trying to decapitate the ability of utilities to get generated power to put in the batteries. So they're trying to kill the ability to get solar, which has come down to 90% in cost. He's done everything possible to strangle wind turbines everywhere he can. He's stopping any offshore wind wherever he can get his hands on it, and onshore wind, by the way. Because he's refused to permit even onshore wind. So calling it a transition is very generous as to what he's doing here, because he's trying to decapitate the ability to feed juice into the batteries, even if we do get a distributed system.
Well,
So,
and this is maybe an amazing transition point because like this is what I told John and I really wanted to have the community hear what you had to say on this, right? But when John and I were talking about, you join in his podcast, and this is one of the reasons I, love talking to John as well. I think you guys share this is, the number one reason I'm such a big fan of yours is I think you're an incredible communicator in the climate space, right? And so, going back to Apollo's Fire, and Bracken's a friend of mine, and that was kind of the first book I ever read where I saw the future, right? And kind of understood, the direction where we were going and how it would make sense. But, just, over the years, your ability to sort of, talk about this and resonate with constituents and folks like that, I think, there's a handful of people maybe who are in your league at doing that. And so, now I think one of the things our community is really struggling with, right, is the winds have shifted, right? And so we no longer talk about climate and we're supposed to talk about affordability, right? And at the same time, I think there's like this pent up frustration in the climate community about like, wait a minute, we're working on like one of the biggest existential threats to humanity, and do we just like pretend that doesn't exist because like rates need to go down? And so, like in this moment, what would your advice for climate entrepreneurs and founders and folks that are passionate about this space be? Like, how do we really talk about this moving forward, given that there's a way to navigate this, right, on affordability, reliability, that kind of stuff, but sort of ignoring the climate piece doesn't feel right to a lot of us.
well, I have the approach that in many, if not all human endeavors, it's not black or white, either or, it's and it's and in this case. And, when you talk about improv, I had a friend, a late friend, who was a great comic and who was a great improv guy. And he would teach improv where it's yes and. So you say yes to the guy who just talked and you add to that. And I think yes and would be the working strategy for us in the climate and clean energy community right now. Because the art form of this is to say yes, whatever you're talking about, and connects to the things that we're talking about in the climate community. So it is affordability and climate at the same time, if not the same sentence in the same paragraph, because they are joined at the hip. And one solving one problem solves the other problem. And we have this kind of delicious blessing where we can do that right now, where we can say both, we solve two problems with one stone, and health and asthma, so it's a health issue, and an economic issue in jobs. And I think that our key is to make sure that we tie them with a ribbon in the same gift box. And that's the job of us as communicators.
Yeah, I think I
And
also would like to point out, Jay, that you're demonstrating in this conversation one of the key attributes of communication, which is an insatiable curiosity. You're the person that we're supposed to be interviewing, and yet you're interviewing Tim because you want to learn from Tim. And I think that this is, in fact, a critical learning element for anyone. Listen, be curious, ask questions, insatiable, right? Because that's informing your point of view that then you get to build on that and statement that you made just before. So you started your communications journey long ago. Your publication of Apollo's Fire was, I believe, reading both, it was the predecessor to the Evergreen Action, right? Because it was a 12-step plan, and you and Bracken laid out in 2007 a very similar dichotomy of how we can go sector by sector, bring down the cost, make it affordable, create more jobs very locally here in the United States, clean up the air, clean up the water, create ultimate competitiveness across the nation. But this isn't a national American problem. Everyone wants electrons. Everyone wants to keep food and medicine cold. Everyone wants to move cargo and people around. So this is an exportable opportunity for us here, not just simply satisfying our own needs. And I think that communications element of listen, insatiable learning, bringing together a very clear step-by-step plan, the way you just laid it out, is learning in itself. So just watching you as an operator is learning to me. I mean, I just learned. So I'm really, it's really wonderful to watch this because Tim and I were talking before this and we said, okay, we're in a complex communication moment here, which is absolutely true. The outcomes will be the same. Solar is the lowest cost of electron generation. Wind very closely behind, whether it's onshore or offshore eventually.
Mm.
Hydro is there, but it's limited in terms of expansion capacity. Nuclear is there. And I think that both Tim and I share, and I'd like to get your view around nuclear. Let's call it fission, let's call it fusion. We know that there's a couple of years before that will be a reality. We're pragmatists. We're pragmatists. Emissions free, domestic electrons. We can shape them as they get out to the edge with energy storage. As you've suggested, the costs are going down significantly. We're not Puritans, but there are certain Puritans on in certain demographics, certain contingencies that say, oh, no, 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 this is out and this is in, and we're going to have a puritanical test. Talk a little bit about that communications challenge.
Well, first off, you commented on my curiosity. Uh, Curiosity is directly reflective of how ignorant you are. So the more ignorant you are, the more curious you are.
Listen, for someone who got into Stanford Medical, you can't really claim that.
Yes, I'm very curious. So you were asking about this approach. I really do believe that this is a moment for more practical decision making and less ideology in these things. And when you think about Trump's great weakness is he makes decisions based on graciously calling it ideology. It's actually a phobia about wind energy and solar energy. It's more of a phobic psychological condition than anything else. My thing is he must have walked under the shadow of a windmill in Holland in his youth, and it scared him, and he's never got over that issue. So I just think trying to make practical decisions, the decision here is what tool fits, right? You're trying to figure out what wrench fits the nut at this moment, rather than bringing some ideological perspective to this thing. My view is that given the nature of this moment where we have to decarbonize very rapidly the entire world economy, you've got to be open to virtually every zero and low carbon generating system that you have available to it. And that there's risks in every energy source, but that the risk of societal collapse due to climate change overwhelms any of them at the moment. So that's where I kind of start the discussion. And then you make practical decisions on cost and the like. Now, every energy source has some environmental negative. Nothing's totally benign. Solar, you have to mine silicon. You have to put up solar panels that otherwise could be used for agricultural purposes. Wind has some bird depredation. There is some bird deprivation with wind turbines. It's not zero. It's not overwhelming. It's certainly 10,000 times less than the collapse of the climate system, which has now reduced our bird populations by maybe 30% because the whole system that they depend upon is getting thrown out of whack as to when things in bloom, and it affects the insect cycle, and insects are down like 70%, which supports the bird population. So that whole collapse of that system probably overwhelms the bird strike problem involving in wind turbines. Then you get to nuclear, which is, of course, the one that's most controversial. Let me start at the top with the best news that I do believe it is a reasonable hope that fusion will be commercially available in the next couple of decades.
Yep.
Here in Washington State, we have 3 fusion companies, one of which is actually beginning construction in Malaga, Washington, with a 50 megawatt small commercial scale fusion reactor. So that's probably the best news on the horizon, because you got zero, almost zero, there's some in the supply chain when you build everything, of course, but in its operation, zero CO2 emitting electricity. That's incredible. And there's no guarantees on this, but from my review of these folks that I've been following now for a decade and a half, I believe they have a very reasonable path to commercial scale in the next decade. They have a contract with Microsoft to actually produce zero emitting electricity by 2028. That's like tomorrow.
In energy world, that's for sure. It's 24 months. Let's see what happens.
So there is a lot of hope out there around fusion, because if it goes, it is like, the answer to our dreams. It's like part of our dreamscape
Mm-hmm.
to have limitless power that you power with seawater, essentially. And so that is of incredible excitement to me. Helion is not the only company. Luann Grisham, governor of New Mexico, was bragging. I was in Rio last week, waving the flag with governors and mayors, so the rest of the world would know there's still some intelligent life here in the United States.
Thank you for your service.
Yes, and Michelle Luann Grisham was bragging that she's got the first fusion reactor in the world in New Mexico, and I said, I'll bet you on that. So we're placing a bet who's actually going to produce the first commercial scale of fusion electricity. We haven't figured out what the bet is, but it's going to be something that's zero carbon. I don't know. The head of
I don't know. Massachusetts might beat you to it with Commonwealth
Massachusetts
systems.
is making the argument too, but Luann Grisham is very aggressive, and so she's asserting her championship. We'll see.
That's a great race to have.
It's awesome.
It is.
And everybody wins.
But the upside of this is really a dream come true for us. So let's just hope that comes through. Then you get the new systems of fission-based electricity, which is, and again, maybe everybody in this podcast knows this, which is totally different than fusion, because fission involves some nuclear waste. It involves some reactor issues, making sure that you can shut them down where appropriate. So it's a whole different kettle of fish. Then you get a question. The big question is, well, two questions. One is, do you want to expose yourself to have an additional nuclear waste at all? That's a question you have to answer. The second is, will it become economically viable? Because right now, the thing that's keeping fission-based electricity away is just the cost.
Yeah.
I mean, the cost of the Georgia reactor that just has come online, or will shortly, is, I don't know, like 10 times the original estimate or some ridiculous amount. It can't compete with solar. It can't compete with wind. It can't compete with batteries. And by the way, everybody badmouths solar and wind, saying it's intermittent. It's not intermittent when you got batteries. It's steady state. It's stable. It's base load growth with battery technology, which is coming down. And one may argue that the race between reducing the cost of long-term battery storage and actually developing a fission-based reactor, you might bet on batteries, because their rate of improvement, which has been 90% over the last decade, is a lot more than the rate of improvement of fission, which might be close to zero. So if you're betting on what's the most likely stable source of baseload energy, looking at the last decade compared to fission nuclear, you might bet on batteries. And say it's just not necessary. And that's kind of probably where I'd make a bet. However, I will say this caveat. I think that the times require us to keep every option on the table as possible. So should we continue some research in there in this? I think we should. To maintain that as a potential option. Because the dire straits we're in without additional sources are something. By the way, I want to say something else before I forget. And I'm triggered by Bill Gates' memo he wrote about this issue recently. We get excited about new technology. I mean, we really do, right? Like fusion, my hair's on fire. I light up even thinking about it. I light up thinking about silicon are coming on. We have two silicon anode battery companies in Washington, Group 14 and Sila. Really, really exciting. But we just can't allow our excitement of the next new thing blind us to the reality that 90% of what we need, we have today. We just need to deploy it.
That's right.
We need to get it into the field. We need to finance the investment to actually swap out some of the fossil fuels based systems for batteries and solar and wind. That's the real issue here, is how we deploy and implement what mankind has in the toolbox today. So I just want to caveat my excitement about what we
No,
can do
you're
today.
absolutely right. And even with nuclear proliferation, you're going to have a need for energy storage anyways, because you have
Right.
variability out on the network, and the network is quite archaic. And unless we're doing like 5 megawatt blocks of fusion, which it may not be economical to do that for some period of time, you're going to have to do big central reactors. And if that's
Yeah.
the case, then you're reliant on the archaic,
Yeah.
aging
So
network.
we had a quite well financed small modular reactor program here in Washington and Idaho, and it was not lack for finance. They had what they needed, but it
Hmm.
collapsed just because of the cost. They finally
Hmm.
concluded that looking at the supply chain costs, it would just not been able to compete with solar, wind, and batteries.
Yeah.
And efficiency, by the way, and efficiency. Let's not forget efficiency as our first energy source, which we try to maximize in Washington. That's why we have the best building codes in the country, to try to reduce the demand side. And we just so infrequently talk about the demand side, which Tim has recognized is so important in managing these spikes on the grid. So
Yeah, load flexibility is the lowest cost for sure. And it's
always
the
the lowest
quickest to
cost.
implement, and
Yeah.
it gets very, very little attention. I want to reference what Tim mentioned before, which is under the leadership of Secretary Granholm and Director Jigger Shaw, the liftoff reports very clearly state that the first place we should be looking in the network is for load flexibility and efficiency. And that is the lowest cost, quickest to implement type of activity. And we only have 50% capacity within the transmission and distribution network. We need to bring that up. We need to bring that up maybe to 60. And if you do that, you're talking about gigawatt hours of potential. So we can get the load growth. McKinsey's recent report around looking out to 2030, 2035 about where load growth is coming from, it's only about 25 to 30% coming from data centers. The rest is coming from things like industrial electrification and electrification at large, at new manufacturing, et cetera. So everyone likes to point the finger and say, "Oh, that they're the bad guys." Well, there's some truth in that, but it's certainly not 66% of the truth, right? That's something different. So we need to be very clear about what we're trying to achieve, and your communication skills. I think everyone can learn from them around being insatiably curious and then being very sort of focused on, give me some steps, give me some real clear action items that I can go after. And I applaud you for that. And as Tim said right at the outset, you've been one of the paramount speakers in this sector around the work we do. And I'm certainly personally grateful. I know Tim is, so much so that he said, "Hey, do you mind if I join to talk with Jay?" And this has been a wonderful session, and I think there's so much to learn from you. And I'm grateful that you've come to speak and learn in the open with all of us. So thank you very much for your time and your work. And I look forward to collaborating on whatever might be in the future for all three of us.
Yes. Well, I'm often wrong, but never in doubt. So I'm a good I'm a good interview. And Tim, I hope you'll send me your contacts. I'd love to have a
I'll
offline
connect you
discussion
guys.
with you. If you can
I'll
do
connect
that,
you.
that'd be great.
And also,
Anytime.
and to know, Jay is writing a book right now. And when do you think it's going to be out, Jay?
Well, next year sometime, we hope. We're
Cool.
putting the finishing touches on it. And but my movie rights of our first book are still, so you
Okay.
can.
Someone can take that one on. Apollo's Fire. Everyone grab a copy, 2007. I also think it's a fantastic read to go reread the Evergreen Action Plan from 2020. It was really fabulous, and your, presidential candidacy, although albeit it was quite short, it had so many of the great sticks, so many of the great platform pieces that I think, could have really moved the needle. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your work. Thank you for your friendship. We got a lot to do together.
Thank you. And don't forget, we have moved the needle.
Yes.
We have. I
Yeah,
mean, sometimes you forget that we have increased battery technology. We got EVs on the road for the first time finally, and we just got to accelerate the progress we've made. So look forward to our next talk.
totally. Thanks, Jay.
Thank you.
Take care.